Now, last but definitely not least, Phil Davis is going to talk a bit about his experience in this area and also sum up what we've heard so far, his views on that.
Does anyone know who this is? Anyone? Perhaps you do now. That was Alan D. Sokol, professor of physics at NYU. In 1996, he committed what was, as the subtitle of his book claims, The Sham That Shook the Academy. It all started with this paper, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which was accepted and published in the humanities journal Social Text by Duke University Press. After his paper was published, Sokol let the world know that it was a hoax by publishing a short description of his intention and the meaning of the act in the now-defunct magazine Lingua Franca. He wrote, "So to test the prevailing intellectual standards, I tried to try a modest, though admittedly uncontrolled experiment. Would a leading North American journal of cultural studies publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if it A, sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions? The answer, unfortunately, is yes." Nearly 13 years later, while in grad school, I tried a similar experiment and asked, would a publisher accept a completely nonsensical manuscript if the authors were willing to pay open access publication charges? The answer, also unfortunately, is yes. All that stood in the way of publication was sending $800 to a tax-free zone in the United Arab Emirates. Luckily, grad students don't usually have this kind of money hanging around, and the lesson had been learned. I retracted the paper, or got the paper removed on grounds that it contained serious errors, and it never went through to publication. The paper, Deconstructing Access Points, was authored by David Phillips and Andrew Kent. Any relationship to persons living or dead is completely coincidental, although it was not written by any human, like Alan Sokol, but by a computer program called SciGen, developed by some computer science students at MIT. SciGen generates scientifically looking, nonsensical manuscripts. In computer lingo, they call this context-free grammar. The manuscript included phrases like this: graphs, figures, and even a reference list. You'll note that citation 3 is from Noam Chomsky, and number 4 is Paul Erdos, the famous and eccentric Hungarian mathematician who died in 1995. Now, unlike Sokol's article, in which he used his real name and affiliation, and which had verisimilitude with a serious article, our manuscript was so outrageous that any reviewer with a modicum of English language skills would have figured out that it was a hoax. It was not my intention to deceive the editor or reviewers, but to test whether a submitted manuscript even went through the editorial process. I even created a fictitious center for the authors. And if the acronym didn't reveal the farce right away, phrenology is the pseudoscience of reading personality traits from the lumps on one's head. The only thing real about the center is a set of attractive T-shirts. The SciGen software has been used for purposes other than bogus journal manuscript submissions. SciGen papers have been accepted to computer science conferences, some of which are infamously known to accept anything as long as the author is willing to pay registration fees, and are often held in kitsch vacation destinations around the world. These pay-to-play conference schemes are known for their email campaigns, one of which motivated 2 graduate students to generate the following submission. And the following figure. Before you're convinced that the practice of submitting bogus papers is merely an attempt to discredit publishers and mock the scientific establishment, there's a lot that can be learned from these experiments. In the early 1980s, two social scientists took 12 published research articles authored by well-known authors at elite psychology departments and published in leading psychology journals, and resubmitted them to the journals that had published them just 18 to 32 months earlier. At this time, it was the norm in psychology to practice single-blind peer review. And while the researchers were interested in whether well-known authors at elite institutions were receiving preferential treatment in the review of their work, or alternatively, that reviewers practice bias against unknown authors at lesser-ranked institutions, what Peters and Ceci did was to resubmit these papers as manuscripts, manually typing each one of them out, but altering the name and affiliation of each paper, substituting fictitious names and institutions for well-known authors and their institutions. Of the 12 resubmitted papers, only 3 were detected as resubmissions. 9 out of the 12 continued through the review process, of which 8 were rejected, mostly on what were described as, quote, serious methodological flaws. An entire issue of the journal was devoted to understanding the results of this experiment and what it meant about peer review. It's a fascinating read and raises more questions than it answers. I asked Stephen Ceci, who is a psychology professor at Cornell, about this experiment, and his brief response was that for political reasons, experiments like this should never be repeated. Now, you may not have also heard of a social work professor named William Epstein, who in the late 1980s conducted a large scientific study on confirmation bias in the social work journals by sending the same manuscript with some experimental treatment to the editors of 146 journals. Now, unlike Sokal, the study was set up with a well-defined and defendable methodology, of which there were 2 arms of the study with sufficient replication to create generalizable results, and which Epstein reports in a dispassionate, objective, and empirical way. In all intents and purposes, this was a serious scientific study. Was Epstein celebrated like Sokal? Absolutely not. The National Association of Social Workers Ethics Committee deemed Epstein's experiment unethical. The association censured Epstein and ordered him to apologize. The ruling was later overturned on appeal, but the sentiment in his field endured. Epstein's experiment did not break any legal rules, but violated unwritten ethical standards. Peters and Ceci also received scathing negative backlash from their field. Powerful editors threatened to sue them or censure them on ethical grounds. Their access to departmental resources was suspended, and it looked like receiving tenure was a foregone conclusion. For my study, I was nearly kicked out of my PhD program on the grounds that I engaged in deceptive research on human subjects without first getting approval from Cornell's Institutional Review Board. John Bohannon, for his investigation, was threatened with lawsuits and accused of being a racist. Now, Sokal, on the other hand, largely avoided the ethical backlash. In fact, he was celebrated by the scientific community and much of the mainstream press over his anecdotal and uncontrolled experiment. At the time, postmodernism drew a lot of scorn from within and from outside the academy, and Sokal's hoax succeeded in discrediting the field. There is a history of these kinds of affairs, and they may be interpreted in many different ways. Are these affairs a kind of hoax or prank, committed with the intention to discredit the publisher and open access publishers in publishing in general? Or are they real experiments where we test a suspected publisher's peer review process? Are they forms of parody or satire, crass attempts of making fun of the scientific and of scientific publishing? Or willful acts of deception or fraud? And remember that misrepresenting oneself is a violation of academic integrity and something that most colleges and universities take extremely seriously, as I experienced firsthand. Now, depending on who you are, you may choose a different interpretation. If done with serious intent, either to expose widespread deceptive claims or to survey the current state of scientific publishing, I personally view these acts as experiments. Their work comes with real risk, however, to the author, which is why they are better suited to investigative journalists like John Bohannon and not academics. This leads me to answering the final question asked of me and the panel about changes that publishers could implement immediately to improve the journal publishing process and restore confidence in it. So first, contrary to much that I read in the news and editorials, I don't believe that there is a crisis in confidence in the journal processing process, and I don't say that because I'm a paid consultant. If there were, we would see academics abandoning the process en masse and bypassing scientific journals. If anything, confidence in the process is only increasing. However, this confidence is not equally shared across publishers and journals and business models. Publisher stings create uncertainty in the marketplace, and uncertainty has the effect of strengthening known brands. As advice to medical researchers in the wake of the second open access publication sting, reported just last week in the Ottawa Citizen, medical professor Roger Pearson recommends that authors stick with the established publishers such as Science, Nature, and Cell, even though their costs are high. The organization of science consists of an exchange of social recognition for information, as Warren Hagstrom wrote in a sociological study of scientists. Indeed, he continues, status as a scientist can be achieved only by such gift-giving, and it assures him of prestige within the scientific community. In such an economy, reputation as a scientist is built slowly and steadily through publication. By the way, this is Alice Meadows' dad, A.J. Meadows, not the headhunter. Reputation, however, boy, that was a good one-liner, wasn't that? I should, remember that one. All right. A.J. Meadows, not the headhunter. Let me continue. However, a reputation economy built slowly upon repeated acts of publication is also highly sensitive to controversy. When scientists engage in unethical behavior, the damage done to their reputations greatly outweighs legal and economic sanctions brought upon them by their universities or funders. Mario Biagioli, who spoke by Skype this morning, described how most actions are, in effect, forms of exile or ostracism from the scientific community, which leads me to my final slide of recommendations for publishers. As an overarching principle, publishers need to work within this reputation economy, meaning that they should work with the communities where reputation matters, such as the scientific societies and associations, but also with the institutions that have the authority over authors, like universities and funders, who have the power to sanction the author with real, not just symbolic consequences when the norms of publication have been violated. It also means being cooperative when journalists like Ivan Oransky call up digging for a reason behind a retraction. Remember that for the reputation economy to work effectively, the fourth estate must be empowered to report upon the news. And lastly, we all need to work against publication models that either incentivizes poor decision-making or creates perverse incentives. For example, paying authors cash bonuses for publication in high-impact journals, a practice that is common in many Asian institutions, engaging in profit sharing with editors based on the number of accepted manuscripts, and perhaps even the British funding model, which rewards entire departments based on the publication acts of individuals. In a room full of international publishers, there may be a real desire to standardize, normalize, and institutionalize scientific publishing. In my view, there is no one science but many sciences, all built around tight communities of individuals, many of whom consider their vocation to be their lifelong career, and given the right set of tools, they will and do maintain order over their discipline. Thank you.